You may have seen this in some of the sessions. She's our scriber for this session, and she's going to be making lots of pretty pictures and graphics to sort of capture some of the content that we're going to be talking about in this session. I know some of you on your way in would have seen some of the scribing that we did in our financial intelligence session that we had yesterday. It's really very impressive, so thank you very much. And without further ado, let me introduce our panel to you, everybody. So on my left, right next to me, I have James Fries. He is the Chief Compliance Officer at Deutsche Börse Group and Clearstream. So I'm going to call him Jim because I understand all his friends call him Jim, so I've already made myself a friend. So thanks very much to him. Next to him is Francis Belmer. There's a theme here because we're going to call him Frank because his friends call him Frank. He's the EVP and COO of Global Operations at Bank of New York Mellon. So thanks very much for joining us. And Jerry is next to him, Jerry Perillo. He's the Chief Information Security Officer at ICE. So thanks very much to all of you. I think the first thing I'd like each of you to do is just to speak a little bit about what you do in your organizations within the context of what we're going to be discussing today about fraud and cyber.
Thanks very much. So I'm the Chief Compliance Officer for the group, responsible for all of our regulated organizations worldwide, which are financial market infrastructure providers, from the trading to the clearing to the custody area, post-clearing settlement, Clearstream in particular, and then post-trade architecture. And we have such a concentration of industry flows coming through us in the securities space. We have an interest in making sure that the vulnerabilities throughout the system, not just within our individual institutions, are looked at. And that's one of the biggest aspects of where we focused on cyber, not just someone attacking ourselves, but trying to raise the bar in all industry participants.
Mm-hmm. Frank?
I manage the global transaction banking operations, best way to describe it, at BNY Mellon, so all of our cash processing and trade, and I also manage reconciliation for the company. But within the cash processing space, I've now also have managed our OFAC operations as well as our AML surveillance and now our fraud detection teams.
Okay.
Thanks, Kavita. I'm Jerry Perillo, and I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at ICE, or Intercontinental Exchange. And we are a group of subsidiaries. We do a lot on the actual exchange space, similar to Jim, of course. And in that place, we do derivatives and securities via the New York Stock, equities via the New York Stock Exchange and on. And then we also have the back-end clearinghouses, and that's really what's relevant for us today. And my remit covers really. It's funny, as a Chief Information Security Officer, that's a relatively new concept, and it means something very different in different organizations. Here at ICE, it's really all of it, which the two real halves are the technical / incident response side, as well as the more proactive risk management side.
Okay, so I don't think there's anyone in this room who doesn't agree with the fact that being on high cyber alert to prevent fraud is definitely the new normal now. I mean, cybersecurity is certainly at the top of the agenda for financial institutions, given all the high-profile security breaches we've had recently. We started last year in February with the Bangladesh event, and that was really interesting because it showed that not only could a commercial bank be compromised, but a central bank can be compromised. And what was interesting about that is we saw the precision of the targeting, we saw the care that was taken in preparations there, and the really heady sums involved that really marked a new stage in cyber attacks, really a watershed event there. And then since then, we've sort of kept them coming, really, when you think about it, because we've had the Equifax breach, we've had the Edgar breach at the SEC, other commercial banks that have been breached as well. So certainly financial services under attack, the industry, absolutely the right time to be having this discussion. And I think what I want to do is look at what does the industry really need to do in terms of cybercrime and anti-fraud controls, and what does this mean in terms of closer cooperation for all the participants in the industry. Here's how I want to structure our discussions over the next 60 minutes or so. I think we want to spend a little bit of time time on pre-2016 and that Bangladesh hack. Then we want to spend some time, I think, on the industry reaction immediately following that event across the 2 years. And then I think we want to spend the lion's share of our time on what does the future actually hold for us? What are some of the things that we are actually going to be seeing and doing and should be doing as we continue forward? So if we want to start with you, Frank, pre-2016, you have actually spent, Frank doesn't look it actually because he looks very young, but he spent 40 years working in the same bank. That's unusual these days. So tell us a little bit about that and what you've seen, really.
Well, I'll tell you, my colleagues at the bank often, tease me. They often say to me, "What was it like working with your founder, Alexander Hamilton?" I have been with the bank a long time. I've certainly seen a lot of change, I'll tell you. And most interesting, I was trying to think of how to really articulate these 40 years from this topic, and I think of the word STP and the evolution of that. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, what were we really focused on? What were the risks? It was really, if you got it, STP meant straight to printer, is what it meant back in late 70s, early 80s. And that was it. Get that electronic message to a printer and process it and be as prudent in terms of quality and executing it on time. What were we doing in the compliance space back then? What do we have, 3 or 4 compliance officers in our company? Today we have armies of compliance officers, right? So that wasn't really high the focus. It was around quality, delivery of the transaction. And then as the 80s and into late 80s, early 90s evolved, what happened? OFAC, our sanction programs we have globally became very much heightened and more was required of us. And we had to add teams. And quite honestly, most of us probably today have armies of folks doing sanction screening and also handling AML surveillance. And now we're going to be adding in the fraud area. So in the 80s and into the 90s, that's what it changed. And we really did a great job of STP, straight through processing, right? We really worked hard. SWIFT was front and center of those efforts in the industry to really get our STP rates up. I think most of us have our STP rates north of 90, I would say today. And that was the emphasis then. Now in this third evolution of STP, I call it straight to person. It seems today, what are we doing? We now are unwinding and stopping a lot of these transactions because of OFAC screening and because of AML surveillance. And now we're going to have to get a lot more, and I'll speak a little bit later about my thoughts around how do we do a good job around fraud detection. So that's kind of how I think the focus and risks have changed over these 40 years, hitting the, as I call it, the evolution of STP.
And Jim, how does that differ from securities?
Well, I think when we talk about fraud, especially how it's changed over time, first it's fundamental that you don't need a regulation or you don't need a push for a bank or a financial institution to want to protect itself against fraud. Why? Because usually you're stealing money from the bank or you're stealing money from the bank's customers, and customers without money are not good customers, right? From the securities industry, it's really the fundamental focus of white-collar crime. So broker stealing from its customer, selling paper that has no value behind it, misrepresenting assets as a type of collateral for loans. That's something that institutions have really developed an innate business sense that we need to deal with. Some aspects of cyber fraud, but I think that's part of what we're talking about today, is just another aspect of misrepresenting the signature when it used to be a paper document or who's behind us, but it's moving much farther beyond that.
And Jerry, you in securities as well. How does that differ?
Well, historically, well, first of all, we kind of shifted from risk management to threat management at some point, and we did that pre-Bangladesh, if you will, and it really worked out well because it gave us a language, a vernacular to describe a lot of these things. And in the past, and today, especially on the exchange side where we run financial market infrastructure, our primary threat objective, as we say, that we were concerned with was sabotage. For a few reasons. I mean, you have the hacktivist type world, and the anarchist, and then you also would have during wartime nations potentially. What wasn't as prominent, though, was what we call cash theft. And in this audience, cash is a very specific reserved word, but I really mean theft for the purposes of monetization. And sure, it existed. We're not consumer, we're not retail, we're entirely institutional, and we were able to really avail ourselves of some control luxuries because of our very finite customer footprint. But as we'll get into in a moment, the types of things that changed, though, are that we saw the threat actors, as we say, that are trying to go at, for one, we saw larger threat actors with more capability going after larger financial transactions than simple payment fraud. And then we saw them being willing to operationalize and invest the education and the time it took to understand what we generally consider complex systems. SWIFT, just generally, the reason why Sibos exists is because it's not trivial. And that was a barrier to entry for the bad guys before. So pre-Bangladesh, I think everyone had a little bit of comfort in the fact that it was hard enough for us to understand SWIFT. Certainly the criminals weren't going to.
Yeah, absolutely. And then after the Bangladesh event, what really changed? What was the immediate impact from what you all saw? Let me start with you, Jim, if I can. What was the reaction at Clearstream of Deutsche Börse?
Well, one of the first aspects was exactly as Jerry just said, shock in terms of these were sophisticated actors who knew what they were doing. They had inside information moving around holiday periods so that there would be lapse before anyone would catch them. But I think one of the most important learning aspects of it is it's not just a question of authentication as to whether it is your customer that is authorizing something. Again, just a movement to another level from what used to be a signature check or a stamp on a paper-based document situation was knowing whether it was compromised, who had access to that authentication controls. And why is that so important? Because it's not just an IT problem or those that are responsible for those keys, as we used to call them. It gets back to the aspect of knowing what makes sense for your customers. And we, just as Jerry said, focused a lot at looking at how we could harden controls over how you move value. It's one thing to get in and access a customer's account. It's another thing to get value out of that. And I do think it's important as we discuss the different types of cases that have developed, like you mentioned already, the Experian case. There's a big difference between trying to authorize a payment to get out than it is to try and steal customer data to then get into someone else's system or to try to get a market advantage. Those are much more sophisticated ways that cyber attackers are coming after the industry.
Yeah, and Frank, obviously, you, as I said, it was a watershed event, Bangladesh. I mean, you sitting in the bank, did you think, oh gosh, this could really happen to us now because they've managed to compromise a central bank?
Absolutely. I think the first thing, at least from our perspective, was the magnitude of it. Mm-hmm. This was not $1 million, $100,000 fraud. So we're talking about billions of dollars. So I think it had to reset everyone's mindset in terms of what are you going to do in your own organization to prepare yourself to avoid such an attack coming through your company. I know our company, what we have done is we've really done a good scan of all of our systems and our networks, our applications, to make sure we know where the vulnerabilities are. We have to do that constantly. And we all are participating in a lot more of desktop cyber exercises, correct? Those things we really need to pick up our game and do more of. And also your internal controls, your internal audits, how often are they being done, and your business processes, what are they? But the one thing I want to come back to is I think of the, know your customer, as we've employed for a number of years. I often think of it's now know your cyber, and I think they are somewhat related because in the Bangladesh situation, if you've got customer A that normally moves this kind of dollars or this number of transactions and moves them to a certain location, you really got to now need to know when it's out of bounds and be able to react to that before it's too late. And I think that's what we're going to see more and more happening now is us building and knowing our clients, the types of money they move, where they move it to. And if you're a correspondent bank or a large bank like our company, we do 300,000 transactions a day. So how are you going to do it? Well, we're going to have to do it from a risk-based perspective. The $1,000 fraud that got through our fingers, so be it. We're going to have to really set back and really look at it really from managing from a risk-based perspective.
But if I could just add on to that, this is not starting from nothing here. Every single one of us probably came here with their credit card, and I've had enough times where my credit card has been compromised. And that's exactly what the credit card companies are doing. They're looking at your profile, what's normal. Fortunately, I travel so much, it's normal to show up with a charge anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
But to do that, as Frank said, on a wholesale basis that all of us are working on, especially when you have intermediated accounts itself, that's a real challenge. And the brazen aspect to go after 100 millions in payments, that alone is not something that would set off a red flag in our institution.
And one other thing to add to Jim is, this is wholesale payments we're talking about. This is not the check or the card processing where you can do it kind of after the fact. This is real time. And customers are expecting, one, we want you to make sure you catch a fraud that comes through maybe from our company, from their instruction to us, but we still want you to make that payment same day. So how do we really balance the urgency of that large dollar payment, and how do we also make sure we're protecting our clients?
How do you do it at Bank of New York Mellon? How do you make sure you manage that balance?
Yeah, and in our case, what we've done is there are systems out there. Some have employed them. Our approach has been, we do what we call a dashboard report, and it's not real time, but it's close to real time. And our objective is start off risk-based, put dollar thresholds, know where you have some more higher risks, maybe countries that don't have quite the infrastructure capabilities that you'd like to see, they're more vulnerable, and we're chipping away at it that way. Because the last thing we want to have is we're failing on all sorts of payments. We're making customers unhappy. At the end of the day, we're not really catching fraud because we're looking at too many transactions. So it's going to be a risk and a reward approach.
Jerry, what about the reaction from sort of non-SWIFT communities after this watershed central bank case?
Sure. So, I mean, being a cybersecurity professional, I wasn't in payments my whole life, obviously, and I still work in a totally different circle. So I could give you the outside perspective. And it really draws an analog to kind of some of the issues that we're having, and it has to do with understanding the subject matter. So people, the layperson sees this, and everybody's seen this headline of SWIFT was compromised, and most of us will know that that's not factually accurate, but we're never going to win that argument, and I think SWIFT did a wonderful job of not being defensive and just playing that literal truth, but rather saying, we're paying attention, we're interested, we want to engage in a dialogue and explain and use the opportunity to educate. That was excellent. So people, assume that we had a infrastructure issue and are willing to, as a result, throw everything at the problem. And that can be an issue. We all have finite resources, time if nothing else. So even if there was unlimited budget, we can only do so many things. So we really have to understand what's really going on and not respond to kind of just the furor over this. And the way that it plays out, day to day is, I mentioned those threat objectives earlier, and we kind of put them in some major buckets. And one of them, and Jim and Frank alluded to this a bit, but one of them is data theft, and you hear about that a lot, and that's what's driving the headlines. And the credit reporting agencies suffer from that, and PII and that kind of breach, personally identifiable information. We hear a lot about that, and as a result, it's easy to equate cybersecurity with data theft prevention. And so we're buying things like encryption and worrying about data at rest and where's the data going and all of that. Here we have issues that are transactional, totally unrelated. And the third real leg of that whole world, by the way, is destructive attacks. And I mentioned sabotage earlier. But we need to cut those up and look at them separately as separate atomic risk with different controls, because otherwise, given our finite resources, we're going to spend a lot of time buying what's being sold by kind of the furor over somebody else's problems, when in this case, if we're worried about transactional fraud, straight to what we call behavioral controls. Those are the relevant ones. Jim mentioned a bit. That's where what's normal, let's baseline that, and then figure out if something deviates from that.
We mentioned briefly the SWIFT launching its customer security program. That was in May of last year. How do you think the industry has received this program, and is it really making the difference to what's needed? Who wants to take that one first?
I can jump on it a bit. So as a financial market infrastructure, we're really a peer organization to SWIFT in many ways, and not just a correspondent. And so when we looked at the Bangladesh event, our first thought wasn't just, okay, well, are we susceptible, but also how did they handle it, and what could we learn from that? So when it comes to the customer security program, we looked at that as well and said, well, can we do something similar? And should we? Do we have a risk here among our customers, our participants? But in general, the way it's been received, like anything, despite the, I would say, extraordinary efforts that were made at communication and clarity, it was, of course, misunderstood quite a bit. And immediately it was thought that it was kind of an audit regime. And I would suspect many of you do think of it as SWIFT opining upon the security of your organization. And that's actually not accurate. It's really a bilateral system that's put in place to allow counterparties to evaluate each other, which is very novel, and I think a very creative way, because I think the former just wouldn't have passed muster. We wouldn't have been able to accomplish that. So as I know, when I engage in dialogue with my peers and I explain that, that's very interesting to them because it empowers the organizations to think about their counterparties and what risks they have with each one, and then they can figure out, well, how much do I care about that attestation? Because it isn't black and white. Counterparties aren't either secure or not. They're either defended against certain risks or not, and so you have to evaluate which ones they are. So I'd say it's been very well received. I don't think it would have been possible pre-Bangladesh, sadly. It took something like that to get people over things like looking inside message contents and that sort of thing. But I think that it's in the right direction, and it's been extremely fast in a good way. But normally these types of things take forever, and it's moved very quickly.
Somebody asking, go ahead.
I can only echo that effort, both in terms of fast and really being endorsed, in particular Clearstream, our board member, Mark Jem, sitting right here. We pushed to it and really made sure that we are committed to using that and bringing it into the international markets through our customers. I think one of the critical points, and you heard that, those of you who attended the discussions, what Jerry just said, this is not a black-white answer in terms of the attestation, and that would be a misuse in some ways of what we're trying to achieve, that people shut down accounts where people truthfully answer that, well, we're still struggling in the cybersecurity area and bringing them up. That causes us to really need to think a little bit more about those risks vis-a-vis the customer. And coming back, that's why we also have taken the position you really need to tie that together with your type of know your customer controls, your anti-money laundering that all of us have talked about, because it is an aspect of serving the customer and protecting the customer by knowing what to expect from them, where the vulnerabilities are, and where you mutually can lead to a better solution.
Somebody asking the question, does the SWIFT customer security program shift the duty of care from the sender to the receiver bank, and is that fair?
It certainly does not shift the duty of care, and that's actually probably one of the most important takeaway tips for people here. Being a lawyer by training, we can talk about processes and controls and risk-based aspects, what we can do with data. But one of the most important things for institutions to take a look at is, what do your contractual terms say in terms of who's liable with respect to this payment that goes out? It's easy when you're a financial institution can say, well, I have a lien over my customer account and I can debit back. That's out of the pocket, but you better be sure in that case. And if you can't recover from your customer, then that's your loss as an economic matter. So I think that is really fundamental, and that is an aspect that probably grates the most, or where you have the conflicts the most when we talk about this push for real-time payments, whether it's in the payment side or if we're talking about T+2 security settlement. Now the question, after the US just went to T+2, well, why can't we move it to T+1 or faster in real time? There's no margin for error in that case. And so you have to make sure there's a real understanding of what we're requesting as a customer, and then what's the potential liability if that does not work out right.
Somebody asking, when it comes to fraud, which regions are the most problematic, and what groups of cyber criminals pose the biggest threat to the financial industry? And I think we saw this with, Bangladesh and some of the other places where we've seen breaches. It's the cashing out element that you were talking about, people being able to get the value and where. And some of these banks were, what I read, it was in the Philippines. It was in certain countries keep coming up. So. Who wants to?
Well, interesting. Jim and I spoke about this yesterday. We were talking about when you think of an AML perspective and the risk around AML, you have FATF is one area you can go to assess risk in a particular region. Is there an opportunity here for FATF in terms of looking at various jurisdictions and the vulnerabilities they present because of infrastructure challenges they have, et cetera? I know there's a political challenge around doing something like that, but does that help, and does that add an element of evaluation that we all would at least take into consideration in terms of how we want to protect our own organizations and our clients?
Okay, I want to move to the future now. What do we think the new normal is? What does the future hold? Let's look at 3 areas I think would be interesting to look at. First, it's regulation. Secondly, the changing requirements that we need on systems, on people and processes. And then industry, collaboration and cooperation. So the future, let's start with regulation. What's the new normal? What does the future hold? Who wants to start first?
Well, I guess as a former regulator,
Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in on that. I think one of the most important things is the initiative has to come from the industry. If we wait for a regulator to tell us what to do, it's too late. And also, one of the aspects, it certainly makes sense, and regulators should put attention to this. They should be asking all of their institutions, well, what steps are you taking here and carrying out their responsibilities, especially for systemic risk beyond the individual institutions. But if the regulators go too far and become prescriptive as to what to do, first, it's backward looking, and second, we run into the aspect of trying to check the boxes here. And some of the regulations that have come out, like the New York State Department of Financial Services, no one can criticize that they say you should have policies in place, responsible officers, but then to have to certify that everything's fine. That's where people start getting worried. We are in an uncertain world, and in particular, certifying events. One of the things I always said as a regulator to the industry is, how many bankers out there, happy to see a raise of hand, have extended credit or given a loan with the expectation that your customer would not pay back? Anybody out there? It'd probably be fraud, and you probably should have got in jail for some side payment. But why do we have then non-performing loans? Or why do we project that 1.2%, even if you have a good institution, will never pay back? That's a risk-based approach. What we need to do here is also a risk-based approach. Jerry's smarter than me, so he may have a better answer to this, but other than shutting down your institution, I don't think you can ever certify that I have zero risk in the cyber fraud area.
Jerry?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And you know, I have come full circle and ultimately concluded that regulation is really another third-party risk management. I mean, in that case, the relationship is between the regulator and the regulated entity, but we also have analogs with us and our vendors, and with our customers, with us as vendors, and we're wrestling with this when it comes to cybersecurity. It's very difficult. I think the CSP program, and I don't work for SWIFT and not plugging for it at all, but one thing that happened between the initial drafts and when it went live, and I think it was in response to feedback, I know we certainly gave this feedback directly, was that it went from being fairly prescriptive to being about the mission. So instead of saying, well, you have to implement this control and that control, it just said, you should have a protection against this threat. And here's one that we recommend. So if you're a small organization, you can just adopt it and be done with this. But if not, then make a case for why your approach is equally effective. And I think that that's the way forward, without a doubt, because the pace of technology alone, if any entity tries to prescribe a control today, it'll be completely antiquated in 6 months. Mm-hmm. So it'd be silly to force that on any organization. So I think we're starting to learn that. And we've given a lot of feedback to the regulatory rule influencing bodies like CPMI, IOSCO. And I think, like Jim said, it's all about getting ahead of it, because if you don't, something will be foisted upon you. And we've seen some good reactions. But I think one of the first things that any entity has to do in assessing third-party risk, and this includes regulators, is go back to that threat objective. I keep on reciting that. But anyone should walk in the door with, this is what we're worried about happening. And then the discussion ensues, and here's the controls that would thus be relevant. Mm-hmm. But starting with just, we're worried about security broadly, is untenable. You can't cover all the things that might contribute to that.
Kavita, I'm just going to say this, maybe a little naiveness on my part, but I hope not. And I really hope that, off of the point that Jim was mentioning around the prescriptiveness from a regulator, is that I think we're all in this together, whether you're a messaging network or whether you're a payment provider or a participant in the payment systems. And we hope as, for instance, CFMI in their document, it's a draft paper. I encourage all of you, if you haven't seen it, take a look at it. It has a 7-point strategy of how to approach this. They met with the 16 top central banks across the globe, and it's open for comment. And the more comments we can give to strike that balance between prescriptiveness and real effect without impacting workflows and not de-risking anything, but just doing a lot of work behind the scenes isn't going to benefit anybody. And I hope that, and the good work SWIFT has done with CSP and its attestation, and by the way, if you're not a large bank, SWIFT offers great tools, by the way. Data validation and their payment detection fraud systems are excellent, and we encourage the industry. So I think it's all of us together coming together to solve this problem.
Somebody asking the question, do you see the end of rules-based fraud detection, and are your institutions looking at new technologies, and how far have you reached in terms of, I love this word, productionizing? Who wants to take that one?
I can jump into that. So I mentioned a moment ago about behavioral technology, and we started doing that in the cybersecurity space before, and it was network-based behavior, which hosts talk to each other, what network traffic is normal, and anything that's odd, even if it's permitted, we get eyes on that. And then it moved into user behavior. So for an individual, a good example, if an employee at our organization scans their badge and walks in, but then never logs into a computer, that's a little bit bizarre. And we add that type of thing together and ultimately come up with this behavioral score. The next frontier for us, and we actually have and I'm recruiting now, this is great. We actually have a position we're creating for a cybersecurity fraud analyst. And we need someone from the payment space to do the same thing with transactions. Because we've gone through things like daily validation reports, and I've personally gone into that. And every organization is different with what's odd. So for example, for Frank, looking at party-to-party net amounts on a basis may be a really good indicator, maybe fairly low standard deviation, and when something pops up, it's good. For a clearinghouse, it doesn't work at all. If there wasn't a lot of trading activity or market movements today, you have nothing, and then suddenly you have $800 million transaction out of the blue. That might set off Frank's radar, but for us, it's very normal. So in our case, we would worry more about the existence of counterparties, because we have a very finite universe. So that is definitely the future, is moving this behavioral technology into the transactional space.
We have a predictive analysis is the two words I think of in today's technology advancement. It's all really around, we go to know your customer, know their profile, where really are your risks, ways into that. But what does a client normally do? This business profile I'm talking about. Our systems today can do a lot of this predictive analysis. We should know on given days what clients move. And once it gets to a percentage of out of bounds, whether it's a commercial payment or a treasury payment, should be able to help us. And that's where we're moving with the building of our systems using predictive analysis. It should be machine learning, right? Artificial intelligence. Those together with this predictive analysis is where we're heading.
And I agree, we have a combination of those tools, but maybe just the one thing to add, because I think Jerry made an important comment, in particular, the individual, so the staffers with the badge, that regardless of the way you harden your systems, one of the weaknesses that we continue to see is your individuals. And
people on the inside.
People, not just people on the inside, but the critical outsourcings that you have. And if you haven't looked at this, probably one of the greatest vulnerabilities every single one of us has is who are your IT administrators, those who see the passwords of everyone else, both internally and externally, because regardless of how many factors of authentication you can put in, those people are the ones who can change things. So your controls, even if it's an aspect for your straight-through processing, these are your standard settlement instructions. If I just change the account number that it ultimately goes to, it goes to Frank instead of Jerry, even though everything else in the process looks exactly the same. And technology can help us in certain ways, but I frankly am befuddled when I see people that think it's so great because on their iPhone they have their fingerprint, or they're like, all that is they saved the algorithm, your password equivalent someplace else. So if I've hacked in and matched what my fingerprint looks like when it comes through, you can use that without any finger needed.
James
So-
Bond type stuff.
It's something that I can't do, probably my kids could figure out. But those who really want to get into that system, that's not a barrier.
I know we touched on some of the systems already, and you've just alluded to some of the people changing requirements and processes. Anything we want to add about changing requirements on systems, people, processes? What's the new normal now, and how do we going to see that changing in the near future? What is stuff that we're going to see in the next 1 or 2 years? Because I got to tell you, yesterday, in a lot of the discussions that we saw, I thought what was really interesting is that we were talking about banks using new technologies and when are those going to come on board. And it was very interesting to me just observing, because the people who are the bankers on the panel and some of the technology people on the panel were, yes, companies would be using this a lot, and it's really they'd use it more if we got more regulatory endorsement, etc. And then we did a vote of the audience, and overwhelmingly the audience said, we're not using any of these technologies because we don't really understand what you people are selling us, and it's very complex and we don't have the expertise. So I think there's a real disconnect there. So I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on this subject about systems, people, processes. What's the norm now and what we're going to see the norm in the near future?
Happy to jump in. One of the aspects is the outsourcing and disintermediation and white labeling of a lot of our services. And I think those are all in some ways related. The notion that any individual institution should have its own hardware, build its own software, control all of its own data in one place is going away. Whether we talk about extremes in terms of digital ledger technology where data is distributed, well, that means that that data is also places where it's out of your control, for good and for bad, right? That's some of the aspect that if anybody changes it, there's multiple people who can detect it. But we need to think about that in a different way, and that's also an area of regulation in terms of understanding what are these dependencies of your outsourcing, what are the critical providers that you have.
Frank?
I'll touch base on the people aspect since I talked about systems. Aside from this cyber type of employee that you try to hire that's really good in information risk, has good educational background in this space and so on. Aside from that, interesting, we have felt that a lot of, we're transforming the way we work, and we're really transforming the people we hire and the skill sets we're looking for. And we have a core group right now, we call them super sleuths.
Super
Sleuths. And they are special investigators that do the normal investigation work, but also do the AML, getting ahead of the AML concerns. Let's face it, everybody, even when we get our arms around Bank of Bangladesh, the fraudsters are going to be one step ahead of us. How do we figure out where else do we have vulnerabilities, and how do we have the mindset of our employees and managers to figure out where else could we get hit, and how would we catch it? So that's kind of what I think is a little bit of a change. What might be going out to your question of future, Kavita, is I think that we're starting really to hire a different mindset of employee because that's where a lot of the work is coming from.
What does this CV of this sort of super spook look like? I mean, what were their experiences before? Where would they have worked before? What are you really looking for when you're hiring one of these people?
Yeah, it's two sets. It's one, have some sort of transactional experience, okay? And the other half is in the area of investigative work. If they have some criminal justice background, and we're adding criminal justice and transaction banking, but also we're trying to run through some case studies of how they really have the mindset, because it's always sometimes tough to hire that thought leader. How do you know someone's a thought leader? Oh, you look like a thought leader, but no, how do you really hire that? And we use test cases to think, are they thinking along the lines of, what if this changed, how would we deal with it? So we're starting to build, I call it my super sleuth team, but it's something I think that could be a future.
I think some of the biggest shifts, one that I really like that I think will resonate with the bank community is, I like to say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, it's dead. We can't do that anymore. I think that's been, everything's about availability in our industry, right? About change windows, about don't touch anything. Oh, everything's working great, walk away slowly. Don't breathe on it too hard, it might fall apart. We can't afford to do that anymore because we've got other people testing it. Criminals are really just the best quality assurance group that you could hire. That's really what's going on here. And they're getting to these bugs and problems long before we can. So the mindset really has to change from that, yes, we don't fully comprehend how this works, but it's humming along, and don't worry, it'll be fine, to we better figure out how it works right now before someone else does. So I think that's a big shift and something we're going to have to do. And yes, we may break a few eggs, so to speak. I mean, that does increase operational risk, and I don't like that, and none of us do, and there's a way to measure that. But at least we can't recoil from change anymore. Another big change that I see, we managed to not talk about blockchain at all. That was fascinating and wonderful. But I'll touch on it a bit. Yeah. So we talked a bit about immediacy of payments. And the ultimate manifestation of that is irreversibility of transactions. Okay. And that's something that we all don't like about cryptocurrencies. It's something that scares everyone. And it's why we're pushing back and why things are slow playing, especially when it comes down to the consumer level. But you could see, even without cryptocurrency at all, that's where we've all been headed, right? The immediacy of transactions. We want things to happen and to be done and done forever. So we're headed that way anyway. So hopefully we can learn from a lot of the technologies and the challenges that come along with cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, that sort of thing, and instead of just saying, that's no good because it's irreversible, instead say, ooh, the irreversible world is here, at least somewhere. Let's study what the problems are there, what the solutions are, because it's going to happen in payments anyway.
Mm-hmm. Maybe just mention one other challenge that we don't talk about much here, especially in the tribe or the big data environment, is data deletion. Right? In the past, it usually wasn't such a problem because we had so many databases that we couldn't really get value out of. That is going away in a positive sense. We can still deal with legacy systems, and what we call it robotics, or different ways to pull data together. All of these external providers that we rely on, whether it's your Gmail account, Google's scanning every single one of those messages, even if they don't go into the details, or so they say, to try and improve their services to the other. That is the business model of every one of these outsourced providers that you have. You have some specific requirements, such as data protection with respect to individuals, but it's also something that some of your customers or some of you, when you're looking towards these providers, may have in your contracts that I expect you to delete some of this data, and some of the enriched legacy data, whether it has passwords or whether it has unique identifier information, that's a vulnerability that now is not hidden from people who wish to exploit it.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about industry collaboration and cooperation. What is the situation now, and what are we going to see in the future?
I'll make one good pitch for something that I heard yesterday in the Swift Institute. There's a paper that's out there public in terms of recommendations for a taxonomy related to cyber risks. And I personally think that's quite important because we've given examples here. There's different types of cyber fraud and cyber risk. We've also clearly said that this is not an aspect where there's competition across industry. There's a type of shared interest, and there are efforts to try and share more information about risks, but we need to be able to operationalize that very quickly. And part of it is finding a way to make sure we're talking about the same thing and being able to pass that information on in an operational way. And I think that's a great type of thing for a group like Swift to do that sets standards. And I think that's something I would recommend people take a look at.
Mm-hmm. One other thing to add is I was actually talking to Tony the other day about, I think best practice sharing is phenomenal. I know we're talking about compromised accounts. Where do we go with this? But I'll give you an example of something that happened not even 2 years ago. It was a classic example of sharing best practice around an incident, and not into what account and what name. No, it's around how did a fraud almost happen. I think it happened in another company. It was simple as someone getting into the CEO's email and just sending an email to the wire payment group, asking to move money. Bang, money was gone. Oh, it's the CEO, must be important, let me do it. We heard about that, and other banks around a group that we pulled together at the Fed, as an example. And I went back, told my team about this. Do you know, about 2 months later, that attempt happened right here in Toronto. As a matter of fact, I have an operation here, and we caught it. Yeah. And to me, I think that it can be more than just accounts, which is important, but of course timing is everything. And I think the more we share and collaborate as an industry, events, practices, I think we're all going to be better off. And I want to regress for 1 second, if I could. I need to apologize about one thing, an important point. We were talking about people before, right? And one big element I forgot is, I don't know how many of you, when you do your recruiting, and local schools, universities have e-crime schools. This is big. And 10% of my hires come from e-crimes education.
Okay.
And that's getting bigger and bigger. I don't know how I forgot that. But whether it's AML or now fraud, e-crimes education is an area I think has been really growing lately, and it's one we're certainly tapping into.
I mean, tell us a little bit about these schools. Where are they, and what kind of institutions? I've never heard of them. Have you guys heard of them? E-crime schools?
It's called Electronic Crime is the name of the curriculum, and it's a bachelorate degree. And students will actually go through different ways of fraud, through the payment system. ACH is an example, the rails of retail payments. They go through AML, and they go through other forms of fraud that may not necessarily all be around payments. It's just about financials. And it's a 4-year program. And we've had some good success tapping into that. And it's up, I can just tell you, upstate New York, not too far from here, there's a school that has an e-crimes program, and I know a few others in the state of New York that have it. And folks from all over the state come up to upstate New York to take these classes. So it's something that's growing. I just thought I'd plant that seed in your mind. You may have it in your own backyard and you don't realize it, but that's an area I think you can tap into.
Jerry?
Yeah, information sharing is certainly very critical, and I think that we've pioneered a lot of it in financial services. Initially, if you step back, the very notion was anathema to the general counsel of all of our firms, the idea that we'd even communicate or share information. The present threat and breaches and vulnerabilities that actually were exploited caused everyone to have an immediate appetite for some degree of information sharing. And we started out with what we call intelligence. So, this happened. And then it went a little deeper. Well, how did it happen? What did the bad guys do? And that is alive and well. And there's groups like the FS-ISAC and the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which is based in the U.S., but is a global org, 7,000 members. All of us, I'm actually with your CISO, Jeff Lungelhofer, on the board of that org. Through, and yours, Jim, Frank is as well. We communicate weekly. That's really worked well to get people talking. So that's on the intelligence side. The next frontier is really on the, all right, so that's the threat, but what are you going to do about it and sharing that, the controls. So, for example, to Frank's point about business email compromise, what we call it, one of the things that we socialize that really is simple, it seems when you think about it, but every org shouldn't have to figure this out on their own, was emails that have wire instructions. If they don't have the word check in it, in either the British spelling or the Americanized spelling, the high likelihood that they're fraudulent because criminals don't want checks. Silly as it sounds, simple little trigger. People build rules around that. All of a sudden, if the email has wire instructions but not the word check or check, then let's get some eyes on it. That type of sharing is the next frontier. And we see, at FS-ISAC, for example, I refer to it as beyond threat intel. So take all of that. That's only 5% of my organization. Let's get the other 95% talking.
Right.
And this is something where the regulators and the governments, if they have not been active in your jurisdiction, whether that case in the U.S. or just kind of globally, or where I sit in Germany, where they've given specific authority and specific coverage to help the institution share. That's something you should talk about with your regulators, because they really have an opportunity to make a difference and to promote that in that regard.
Just a few minutes left, and what I want to get to is, I'm glad we mentioned best practice, because for all the people sitting in this room, going to go out those doors in a few minutes, and what should they take away in terms of the top things on the to-do list when they get back, in terms of, fraud? It's the new normal. We have to be on high alert. What are the number one, top 3, 4 things that should be done?
I'd make sure first that it's understood that this is a business issue. This is not just your IT guy or the guy who reports to your risk or your security. It's something that you need to look at and understand where your exposures are at the business. And as I said before in many examples, your risk tolerance. in the business. And as you develop new products, services, look at new customer bases, this is some of the aspects you should put in as part of your strategic planning and the risk return. Other aspect, the tip I gave you as the lawyer, make sure that the contractual documentation and this who bears certain liability risks is looked at. And then, as we discussed, if you haven't engaged in some of those collaborative efforts, both in terms of sharing what's from the industry or potentially pushing back in. When we talk about moving past the SWIFT attestation and that steps, I wouldn't be surprised seeing future arrangements where there's an expectation that your customer reports to you incidents in the same way that your outsourcing people have to report to you incidents in that regard, and that'll be part of the diligence that's applied to you.
One, I guess, know your vulnerabilities. Make sure you continue to look and assess where your vulnerabilities are. Two is build this business profile around your flows and your transactions so you really know what's norm versus what's outside of the norm. Make sure it's risk-based. Start somewhere, risk-based. Get involved. I'll tell you, there's so many good tools out there that SWIFT offers, and I really feel the more you participate in the industry discussions, the more we all can drive excellence around this topic.
I would go back to that threat objective term again, but whenever we're having any of these conversations, whether it's about investing resource or working with your CISO or anything else, it should all be framed in a scenario. And here's what we're worried about happening. And if you can't articulate it, then you're not ready. And you can get experts and you can sit down, and you can use existing fraud that already took place and just kind of mirror it over to your organization, how it could happen. And if you fail on that and you just can't figure out a way it could possibly happen in your organization, then maybe you've accomplished the mission. But if and when you do figure out, well, okay, we're now on the same systems, but this could happen, then you'll be very targeted on your controls and on your investments and on your analysis. And I think that's really important. And whether you're assessing third-party risk or your own internal risk or anything else like that, really have an idea of what it is that you're worried about and articulate it very carefully.
Do you think when we look back at Bangladesh, we look back on it as a minor event that has triggered big change and has actually improved the industry as a result in terms of the outcomes so far have been good?
It was a wake-up call.
Absolutely a wake-up call, and we were lucky. Could have been a lot worse.
And I can say, from our perspective, I don't look at it as, wholesale payments are on the radar now. I look at it as complicated systems are on the radar. So the sky's the limit for that, right? I mean, we run exchanges, things like that have bespoke protocols, that type of thing. I start thinking about that type of thing next. And there's no end to it, whether it's the defense industry or military systems. Complicated systems are in play now. So when I look back, I'll think of it as being the watershed for that new paradigm.
But again, that's not the only one. We've mentioned a couple of times the other aspect, the Experian, which is more at the consumer, the retail level, the aspect of the SEC.
Well, that was, I think that was really interesting. We're starting to see breaches in different parts of the financial system.
But that's an interesting one in a different way. The aspects, I think of, I'd say a little bit less of a wake-up call because one of the modus operandi was going into the regulator, getting early reporting to use that for insider trading. So securities industry, white-collar fraud, again, not being targeted against the regulator itself. But around the world, we have increasing reporting requirements driven by financial stability issues. And whether you wanted to get an idea of what are the positions of your competitor, or you wanted to try and pre-trade, or you wanted to get an idea of order books in balance that's not easily available as part of a high-frequency trading scheme, this aspect of insider trading, getting ahead of the markets or using information is not new, it's just expanding in the way. So a generation ago, some of the first cases and penalties and criminal convictions came against the aspect that when you had a prospectus, first it had to go to the printer. And someone who was at the printer knew a day before what was said in that paper. Now we've gone to light years ahead. So you need to think about all those aspects of the vulnerability for the use of data, to the movements of payments, to getting after your individual risk factors from persons.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Before you go anywhere, everybody, let me just remind you that you can rate these sessions. I think you do that on your app. I'm sure you've been doing that throughout the conference. And if I can ask you to give our panel a warm round of applause and to thank you for coming as well. Thank you.